The Middle East is boiling right now, and everywhere you turn, there is some sort of explanation. People taking sides, history lessons being dished out, and there are lots of opinion pieces out there. But before we consume yet another one, let me take you through what is really going on. It happened on Saturday, the 7th of October 2023. The Israelis were wrapping up a 7-day-long celebration of the Jewish festival of Sukkot, when suddenly, just before dawn, they began to hear this. Echoes of sirens ring across the country. People running for safety as they quickly realized this was no joke. Something is happening or about to happen. But before they could figure out what was upon them, they began to see lightnings as thousands of missiles rained from the skies right above them. Speedboats ferrying armed fighters rushed down from the coast. Hundreds of armed fighters, many on motorcycles, charged into cities and villages after using bulldozers to breach fences separating Israel from Gaza. Chaos was unleashed, and then terror, as these fighters began shooting at both civilians and the Israeli military. This was Hamas, and for the first time in decades, they have managed to catch the Israeli Defense Force off guard. As the Hamas fighters stormed Israeli beaches and villages, they left lifeless bodies of innocent victims on the streets. The militants could be seen bursting into houses, shooting residents begging for their lives, and taking others hostage, driving the terrified captives back into Gaza, as many of them screamed for help. The victims include women, children, and the elderly. But hold on a second. Who or what is Hamas, and why this terror on Israel at this time? Also, we've heard a lot about the Israel-Palestine crisis, but the Israeli Defense Force have always been able to repel attacks, sometimes even stop them before they happen. So, how did these people manage to surprise the most sophisticated military intelligence unit in the world? This is not a simple story of good guys versus bad guys. The issue at play here is a lot more complicated than that. What we are witnessing is a story of two groups of people fighting for survival. A story about a war which must have a winner that will make their version of events the only true history. But while it might not be a story of good guys versus bad guys, this evil unleashed on the state of Israel by Hamas is threatening to send us deep into another catastrophic war in the Middle East. A war I think the Israeli Defense Force has already won. But, and there is a big but, it's not going to be an easy ride for the United States this time. Surprise? Of course, the big boys are always going to get involved somehow. Well, let's get through the basics. First, Hamas. Who or what is it? This right here is Gaza, home to over 2 million Palestinians. It is a small strip of land that's been under land, sea, and air blockade by Israel since 2007. Even though it is densely populated, the people living here can only get out with Israeli permission. Often referred to as the world's largest open-air prison, the Gaza Strip is also home to a political and armed group known as Hamas, an Islamic resistance movement that has been fighting the Israeli force for years. Hamas likes to refer to itself as a political party with a military unit. Since winning an election there in 2006, it has taken full control of all the affairs of Gaza. Hamas is also part of a regional alliance that includes Iran and the armed group Hezbollah in Lebanon. After many attacks on Israeli targets over the years, the group was designated as a terrorist organization by Israel, the United States, EU, and others. Despite this proscription, many Palestinians still see Hamas as the most active group when it comes to resistance against Israeli occupation. In fact, recent polls show that popular support has been growing for Hamas, with an estimated 50% of Palestinians in support of being represented by Hamas. Now, the wars between Israel and Hamas have usually been an exchange of fire across the Gaza border. Hamas fires rockets into Israel, Israel drops bombs on Gaza, with civilians often becoming collateral damage. But not this time though. Somewhere along the lines, Hamas changed tactics and decided to take the fight to Israel, making it all the more shocking and
an unprecedented attack.
An unprecedented.
It is unprecedented.
Which is the big word being thrown around by every media house. Anyways, this leaves us with the big question. Why is Hamas attacking Israel, and why in this fashion? According to Hamas, the attack on Israel is called Operation Al-Aqsa Flood. This name doesn't immediately ring a bell, not until you take a step back to a few days just before this attack. Before the devastating attacks by Hamas, over 200 Israeli settlers forced their way into Al-Aqsa Mosque compound in East Jerusalem on the 5th day of the Jewish holiday of Sukkot, under the protection of Israeli police. You have to understand that this place right here is a hugely contested religious site. Hamas said it launched its attack in response to the desecration of Al-Aqsa. They also say the attack was a response to decades of Israeli violence and occupation of Palestinian lands, a story I'm not going to get into in this video. However, the panic being felt as a result of these recent Hamas attacks and the wailings on the streets of Israel have awakened the Israeli Defense Force, who are now threatening to wipe the group off the face of the earth.
Though Israel didn't start this war, Israel will finish it.
Israel has called up 300,000 military personnel from its reserve, and it looks like the ground invasion of Gaza is now imminent. With military mobilization already underway, it is now a matter of when, and if that were to happen, Israel might just have won this war before it even began. Now, here is why. Hamas and its military unit has been designated as a terrorist organization by the State of Israel, the United States, Canada, and the United Kingdom. The European Union designated Hamas's military wing in 2001, but after much pressure from the US, that title was bestowed on the entire Hamas operation in 2003. Although many other states including Russia, China, Syria, Turkey and Iran consider the armed struggle waged by Hamas to be legitimate, terrorism has been one component of its struggle for self-determination, hence the proscription by the US and its allies. But why is this relevant? You see, when a group is proscribed as a terrorist organization, it becomes unlawful for a person in the United States or subject to the jurisdiction of the US to knowingly provide material support or resources to that organization. When I say subject to the jurisdiction of the United States, you need to understand that the US wields an enormous amount of influence that once they call you a terrorist, many governments around the world are bound to see you as one, and they must stop aiding all activities you are involved in. Also, any US financial institution that becomes aware that it has possession of or control over funds in which a designated organization or its agent has an interest must seize such an asset and report it to the US government. This means Hamas is under intense surveillance by all US allies at all times, and the group cannot get funding from anyone or organization associated with the United States. Otherwise, there will be hell to pay. But worst of all, if this proscribed organization is to get an armed conflict with an ally of the United States, the rule book goes out the window. As you already know, the United States doesn't negotiate with terrorists. Rather, they unleash a full force of their military, taking down whatever stands in their way until such a group is completely decimated. At least, that's what we are told. So again, Hamas is now in the firing lines of the United States. Should the Israeli government declare a full-scale war on the group, the United States will be there. Maybe not with boots on the ground, but military gadgets, arms and ammunition never before faced in battle might be unleashed on Hamas, a scenario I don't see them recovering from. But hold on a second, why was Hamas even designated as a terrorist organization? If all they are doing is fighting for the liberation of their people and for Israel to get out of Palestinian lands? Well, I promise not to get into the history side of things, but Here's just a little something. Hamas has defended suicide attacks as a legitimate aspect of its warfare against Israel. In fact, in 2003, Hamas resumed suicide bombings in Israel as a retaliatory measure after the failure of peace talks and an Israeli campaign targeting some members of the Hamas leadership. This is a big deal because suicide bombings are considered as crimes against humanity under international law. In addition to killing Israeli civilians and armed forces, Hamas has also murdered suspected Palestinian-Israel collaborators, even members of its rival political party Fatah, which rules over the affairs of the Palestinians in the West Bank. In the wake of the 2006 Israeli conflict with Gaza, Hamas was accused of systematically rounding up, torturing, and summarily executing Fatah supporters suspected of supplying information to Israel. According to Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas, during 2014 Israel-Gaza conflict, Hamas killed more than 120 Palestinian youths for defying house arrest imposed on them by Hamas, in addition to 30 to 40 Palestinians killed by Hamas in extrajudicial executions after accusing them of being collaborators with Israel. However, with all that said, only a few countries designated Hamas as a terrorist organization. But will the latest onslaught on Israel increase that number? That brings us to my second point as to why I think Israel already won the war. 3 days after Hamas launched its attack, there were still gun battles going on between Hamas fighters and Israeli forces in 3 main areas in southern Israel, which is bad for a country that doesn't like to be perceived as weak. Remember, the Israeli army is one of the world's most sophisticated military and intelligence organizations. The border with Gaza is said to be heavily monitored, that any kind of communication going in and out of Gaza, at least in theory, would be listened to by Israel's intelligence units. So, this recent attack by Hamas raises questions as to Israel's military capability, which isn't a good look for Israel since it likes to be seen as the strong man in the Middle East region. This has resulted in Israel's Prime Minister vowing an unprecedented response and says it plans to wipe out Hamas's military capability and end its control of Gaza. Israel has since been hitting Gaza hard with airstrikes and artillery, but just how far it is willing to go remains to be seen. So the question then becomes, can Hamas stop the slaughter? That brings us to my next point. Hamas is fighting an army that has sophisticated heavy weaponry and air power. In the face of that weaponry, Hamas has nothing more than homemade IEDs, rockets, and light weapons supplementing a small number of more sophisticated light weapons it managed to smuggle in. This is why the group relies on tactics, using a strategy of hit-and-run attacks, ambushes, and sniper fires to minimize their own casualties and maximize the impact of their operations by reducing direct confrontations, a tactic they turned away from with their recent attack. Armed drones have been used for the first time by Hamas to take out Israel's most well-defended tank, the 𝗪𝗃𝗿. So, Hamas is like David fighting Goliath in this instance. What a reverse that is from the biblical story. But will it end with David on top? Should that likelihood ever materialize, there is a secret weapon that Israel can call upon any day and time to make sure they don't lose, and that is the United States. The US will always find facts and narratives to suit its agenda or a cause they believe in. God help you if you're on the other side of things. It is no news at this point that the US spends an estimated $3 billion on Israel annually. Most of this goes into funding the Israeli Defense Force. The alliance between Israel and the United States is one that will play a huge role in how this conflict plays out. A US warship is already sailing to the region in a show of support for Israel. And just as Biden has shown in Ukraine, the United States will not mind funding the war effort, no matter how long and hard it gets. Although there is the election coming up next year that may make things a bit tricky for Biden. Aside from the US election making things a bit difficult, the Israelis will not find things easy for some other reasons as well. One of those is the Iran factor. Of all the Arab countries, there's arguably one with more hatred for the state of Israel than Iran. Following the October 7th attacks on Israel by Hamas, Iran's foreign ministry said the attacks by its ally Hamas on Israel on Saturday were an act of self-defense by Palestinians and called on Muslim countries to support their rights. The Iranian government has been building up forces and continues to ally with any militant group willing to wage war against the state of Israel. Aside from Hamas, Iran also supports Hezbollah, another designated terrorist organization with its well-established hatred for the state of Israel. So, should these forces unite to fight Israel, it will be an all-out war that threatens to throw the entire Middle East, which is already prone to violence, into an unprecedented chaos. One the United States cannot afford at the moment. Why? Because they have this small matter of Ukraine war that has refused to end. That brings us to my next point. Can the US fight two wars at the same time? You see, after 9/11 in 2001, the United States was thrown into an all-out war against terrorism, one which lasted for 2 decades in Afghanistan and another in Iraq, costing taxpayers an estimated $4 trillion. While I won't get into the disaster that the war in Iraq brought, I will point to the fact that in 2023, a similar situation is already building. If the United States is dragged into the Israel-Palestine conflict in a full-scale military invasion, it is surely going to involve some confrontation with Iran, which means another US boots on the ground in the Middle East, at the same time that Biden's government continues to funnel billions of dollars into Ukraine as the war in Europe rages on. So, can the US really afford these two wars dragging on for God knows how long? And how about the humanitarian crisis that will arise as a result of the conflict? There's also the issue of more terrorist groups springing up as arms are recklessly shared in the region. It begs the question, is the world on its path to a third world war? Because once you fit the US in the equation, Iran jumps in. So do the other Arab nations, and who is to say NATO will totally abstain? While it may seem so easy for Israel on paper to crush Hamas and bring this war to an end as quickly as possible, there are so many factors at play here that make that belief impractical. Conflict of this nature with its complexity is difficult to predict. We can only hope that both sides resolve their differences or find a common ground to end the bloodshed, as innocent civilians from both sides are now the collateral damage from this war. Thanks for watching. Let me know your thoughts below and I'll see you soon.